Hey, folks, welcome to the Rob Breakenridge Show. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode. We will, of course, talk about the federal budget, the political stakes, and what the actual economics of this budget are. Later on in the episode, we'll also talk about an important criminal justice issue. Now, this comes off the heels of a Supreme Court decision last week. Now, once again, it's opened the debate or reopened the debate, continued the debate perhaps, around the notwithstanding clause. The opposition conservatives and other voices, including Alberta's premier, are urging the federal government to use the notwithstanding clause, which would be the first time for Ottawa in response to this Supreme Court decision. What the court did in a 5-4 decision was to strike down as unconstitutional the mandatory minimum sentence of 1 year in prison for the charge of possession of child pornography. And the way in which the court came to this conclusion has been controversial in terms of the actual cases before them, but also considering a hypothetical case and whether the mandatory minimum would still be reasonable in that hypothetical. So as it stands now, the mandatory minimum is gone. So as mentioned, there is pressure on the federal government to invoke the notwithstanding clause. They've said they aren't going to do so. So does that just mean government throws its hands up, this decision stand, and that's that? Well, there is potentially another path here. University of Alberta law professor Steven Penney wrote a really interesting piece this week laying out this alternative path that could still come close to restoring something approaching a mandatory minimum sentence. We'll talk about that later on. But let's get into the federal budget off the top here in this episode. Now, there's the political question, I guess, regardless of the merits or shortcomings in this federal budget, whether it's going to pass. And of course, if this budget doesn't pass, that means there is going to be a federal election about 8 or 9 months after we had the last federal election. And I'm not sure anybody wants that right now. But we could still find ourselves accidentally stumbling into an election anyway. Now, the Conservatives and the Bloc have both said they are not going to support this budget. It is important to note, by the way, though, that the Conservative caucus has been reduced by 1 this week, as a Nova Scotia Conservative MP has crossed the floor to join the Liberals. Now, that still leaves the Liberals in minority territory, but just barely, with 170 seats and 172 needed for a majority. So the Liberals are close to having the votes they need to get this budget passed. So the Conservatives are out. They think the budget's too liberal. The Bloc is out. They think the budget's too conservative. So it leaves the NDP, and it also leaves the Greens, because there are 2 Green Party MPs in the House of Commons. The Greens have said they're open to maybe potentially voting on the budget, and the NDP have kind of said the same thing. The NDP, by the way, have also floated the idea of abstaining from the budget vote, which would be one way of helping it get passed. Now, it's unclear what these 2 parties would be demanding. It's also unclear to what extent the Liberals are willing to compromise on anything. I mean, the Liberals do seem to be approaching this like they've got a majority, in the sense that it doesn't really feel like they've reached out to the other parties or tried to bring them in or include certain measures in this budget to ensure that the other parties would support this. It's kind of, here's our vision, here's what we're going to do, but there's no guarantee the other parties are going to want to go along with it, and maybe so much of this hinges just on hoping or assuming that nobody wants an election right now. So whether the Liberals are prepared to make any changes to win over the NDP or win over the Green Party, all of that remains to be seen. So that's the political side of it, whether this budget will pass, whether we're going to find ourselves in an election, and just with everything going on, that would be, I think, a real terrible signal to the U.S., to our other trading partners. But it could happen. Now, is that to say that we should want, or do we need this budget to pass? This was billed as a budget that's to meet the moment, the budget that Canada needs right now, a transformational, a generational budget. Now, certainly that was the talk going in. Whether it lives up to that, though, I think is another question. This is a big spending budget, $78 billion deficit that the government is running here. And that's, of course, on top of all of the borrowing that the government did during the pandemic. So that is going to push up the debt. It's even going to push up debt to GDP levels. And in a few years, just the amount of money the government's spending on the debt is going to eat up about 13 cents of every dollar the government spends. So that's not insignificant. Now, mind you, there is more of a focus in this budget on trying to stimulate investment in the Canadian economy, something that's been sorely lacking in recent years, or for quite some time, honestly. And there are some positive steps in that direction. Again, whether this is transformational or generational, maybe not. But there are some positives in this budget. But at the same time, I think the amount of spending, the growing deficit and debt, that's worrying too. So when we factor in the good and the bad, what does this all actually mean for the Canadian economy? Does it diagnose the problem correctly? And what do we make of what it offers to try to address and shore up all of these challenges we're facing? So, joining us for some further analysis of this budget, we're joined off the top in this episode here by Trevor Tombe. He's a professor of economics at the University of Calgary, also director of fiscal and economic policy at the School of Public Policy. Policyschool.ca is the website. Professor Tombe, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
In terms of the focus of this budget, the structure of this budget, how different is this than what we've seen in previous Liberal budgets, first of all?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, the budget is quite different than any that we've seen over the past many years. And just one simple illustration of that is this is the first budget that has, as its very first chapter, its main focus, one focused on the broader economic environment of Canada, the investment environment, and so on. So you have to go back to Budget 2015 to find the last one when that was the case. And so I've gone through each of them. And more recently, they've been focused on narrower issues related to housing, or earlier on in the Trudeau government, growing the middle class, things like that. So this is the first one that kind of returns to a clear focus on the economy. But there is a disconnect, I think, between the language used in the budget and the measures that we actually saw within it. So a clear change in tone, but I think maybe more continuity than change when you look at the actual measures that the budget laid out.
Mm-hmm. And we can get into that. I did want to ask you, I mean, we went through this debate in Alberta when it comes to capital spending versus operational spending.
Right.
Ultimately, if the government's borrowing, it's kind of irrelevant, I guess, what that's going toward. But I mean, does it make sense to distinguish spending in that way? And what are the lessons learned from what happened in Alberta on that?
Yeah, so I think we should distinguish what the federal government did in this budget from what we saw in Alberta. So first, what the federal government did is introduce a different way of accounting for certain types of expenditures by government and classifying them as capital investment. And so this is an approach that tries to, or the government hopes to, identify different objectives of certain initiatives. Increasing the stock of capital is quite clearly something that the government correctly points to as a real problem for Canada's economy over the last several years. Weak business investment, weak capital formation, that's underlying the productivity challenge that the economy has. And they want to highlight that they're taking steps to try and boost the amount of capital investment that is occurring. So I agree with their diagnosis of the problem. And so one way to address that from their perspective is to highlight some of the initiatives as aiming to boost investment rather than just increase consumption, if you will. That's a little bit different than what we saw in Alberta, because the feds are not changing how we calculate the deficit, for example. So the deficit number that's there in the budget is comparable to what would have been reported as the deficit in the past. What Alberta did was to split the budget into different silos, if you will, really carve out from the budget what the government considered part of its capital plan. And then the fiscal plan was what was focused on in terms of the deficit. And they never presented something that was consolidated. And so they made the budget in Alberta at the time harder to understand. And that diminished the level of transparency for the public, made it hard to evaluate the pros and cons of different government choices. And so what the feds did was really just introduce more information rather than take information away, which was Alberta's approach.
Yeah, which makes sense. So with the focus, though, on government spending or capital investment, well, at the same time, talking about the need for more private investment, to what extent are those objectives at odds or in conflict with one another?
Yeah, so it can go either way. So some government measures, I'll point to one, which is the change that was introduced last fall, so prior to this budget, but accelerating the rate at which companies can write off their own investments. And for manufacturing, it's actually a really big effect. This drops the effective tax rate that we levy on investments in that sector from a little over 8% before to nearly zero now. And so that's a measure that removes, or I should say, eases a disincentive for private investment, a tax change that may move the needle a little bit on businesses making new investments in that sector. When you look at government spending, though, and how it aims to boost investment, this is something that spans a lot of different categories. And the main one in this budget, basically the only source of meaningful change in government policy on the capital investment side, is what are called capital transfers to other entities. So it's effectively a government subsidy to others to increase the amount of capital stock, and largely, in this case, provinces. And so there's some cost sharing if this is successful in the future, and provinces would then roll it out in increasing the amount of roads and other types of infrastructure that, if done smartly, can also facilitate private economic activity as well.
There's a large deficit along with this budget, and I mean we've seen it in the past, the fiscal crisis or COVID, where governments do increase spending and borrowing in response to a crisis. I wonder if this kind of meets that threshold, or how this deficit compares to other previous sort of emergency deficit.
Yeah, that's a great question. So government borrowing, as we see, say, for example, in the financial crisis under the past government, naturally, the deficit will rise during recessions. Revenue falls as unemployment rises and income tax payments fall, and government spending rises too as joblessness increases. And sometimes also, as we see, kind of stimulus measures, if you will, to try and boost the economy are rolled out. So the short-term hit that the government budget balance takes during difficult economic times, that's fair enough. And maybe that's part of what we're seeing here, but it's not the biggest driver of the change in the overall government's budget balance. So where did we think the budget deficit would be prior to this year? Well, the government's last estimates here was that it was anticipating $42 billion. That's what they put out in the fall of last year for the deficit this year. And the weakening economy and those kind of developments beyond the government's control, that would increase that deficit by about $7 billion. So that brings us from 42 to $49 billion. But the actual deficit that we see in this budget is $78 billion. So most of the increase is actually due to policy choices rather than a weakening economic environment that we're operating in. And those big policy, there's a lot of policy changes. Some are the personal income tax cut, for example, that we saw. Also increasing military spending and a wide variety of other initiatives as well. But it's policy choices that have led to the large increase this year. And then looking out, the deficit is something that remains fairly large all the way out to 2029, 2030. The government anticipates about $57 billion in terms of the deficit that year. Whereas previously, the fall of last year, they were projecting out $23 billion. And again, policy is a big driver of that increase. And so I'd say this budget, people can agree or disagree on the personal income tax cut or the military spending or the weakening economy, but that's what's really going on this year. It's the longer term change in the overall debt trajectory of the federal government that represents a really clear departure from where even the Liberal government was hoping for as early or as recently as last fall.
Well, the so-called fiscal anchors, right? We seem to be moving a little bit away from debt to GDP ratio. This budget talks about net debt to GDP ratio. What does it tell us about that changing debt picture?
Yeah, so it's fair enough to think about net debt, and that generally is the total amount of gross debt minus liquid financial assets that governments have. That's completely normal and not unique to this particular government. But previously, the fiscal anchors, if you will, of the government, and for those who haven't heard that term before, fiscal anchor is simply a measure that tries to guide fiscal policy choices of a government towards something that's sustainable in the long term. And previously, the government talked at length about declining debt to GDP ratios and bringing the budget balance, the budget deficit, to less than 1% of GDP. But we see in this deficit, the government has changed its fiscal anchors to declining debt to GDP, so that's consistent. And then second, balancing what they call the operating budget by the out years of their projection. And that's pretty problematic for a couple of reasons. First, fiscal anchors aren't worth very much if you're changing them every year, right? They need to be consistent. They need to be something that people can point to as a guide to fiscal policy choice, as a source of discipline. And if a government is changing them all the time, then they lose credibility. And then second, the declining debt to GDP ratio, well, I think that is a sustainable measure. Like if you have declining debt to GDP, then that's sustainable, kind of by definition. It's just the problem is in this budget, we see rising debt to GDP in all but 1 year. And we end by 2030 with debt levels as a share of GDP higher than this year and last. And so the government has moved away from using that fiscal anchor to guide its medium-term fiscal policy choices. And then third, balancing the operating budget. So this is something that the Prime Minister campaigned heavily on, really talks at length about. This is somewhat artificial because it is simply what the deficit is after you strip out what the government has decided to be counted as capital investment. And there's a great deal of discretion that goes into what you're counting as capital investment and what's not. So it's something that, for me, doesn't actually come with a lot of information. So balancing the operating budget doesn't mean much.
Well, and with that rising debt comes increased borrowing costs. So, the amount of interest that the government has to pay each year on that debt, as that takes up a larger share of the overall budget. How much of a problem, or how much does it tie the hands of the government in the years ahead?
Well, so by 2030, the government anticipates about $76 billion in debt service charges. And for perspective, that's about 13 cents of every dollar of government revenue. That's certainly less than where Canada has seen itself before in the 1990s, for example, but higher than where we were prior to COVID. And that's a source of fiscal pressure on the government. It's a constraint on their range of options. It's a spending item that will crowd out other priorities, either on the spending front or on the tax reduction front. So it is a source of concern. I'd say it's not something that we should be overly concerned about in the short term, in the sense that it's manageable. One can agree or disagree with it, and personally, I would have preferred to see more emphasis placed on declining the overall amount of federal debt, if only just to more prudently prepare for some longer-term challenges and to prepare for potential for the next recession or a big negative shock that we may hopefully not see, but you need to be prepared for it. But this is a trade-off that the government is making. Rising debt service costs, while manageable, does represent an increase in the amount of risk that they're taking on.
Well, again, if this is a budget meant to bolster Canada's economy or help us get through some tough times, the growth forecasts in this budget are pretty modest. So what does that tell us about the impact that these measures or even attempts to stimulate growth and investment? How effective is all of this going to be?
Well, the short-term challenges that we're seeing this year that are almost surely going to be carrying forward into the next year, I think it's fair to say I certainly am of this view that it's beyond the control of the federal government here to change the unpredictability and uncertainty that we're seeing south of the border. And that's the biggest source of drag on investment and hiring and economic growth broadly in Canada. And so the growth that they're anticipating for this year is just a little over 1%. And in 2026, not really all that much stronger, at 1.2%. And then in the outer years, growth is going to be around 2%, kind of largely where we were previously projecting growth to be in fall of 2024. And so if these measures were really something that would meaningfully boost longer term growth, then we would expect to see higher growth anticipated by the government than it was previously projecting prior to this year. Now, the measures in the budget are actually fairly modest. So I mentioned this before, that there's not a lot new in the budget that will fundamentally change the growth trajectory that we're on. The big one that I think has a lot of merit to it is accelerating the ability of companies to expense certain types of investment, immediate expensing. This effectively lowers taxes on new investment. But that's not new. That was something that was announced prior to this year, prior to the current prime minister, prior to the election. So it being in the budget is great. That's the kind of continuity that's certainly welcome, but it's not itself moving the needle much at all. And then new investment, the budget is framed as facilitating, enabling generational investments, and touts a dramatic increase in what the government considers to be capital investment. But even putting aside what the government is calling investment and what it's not, a very small amount of the increase is actually new in this budget. Only about $8.3 billion of the total 27 annual increase that we're seeing by 2030 is new. Most of it was in past fiscal plans prior to the current prime minister, prior to the election, prior to this year. And so that's also not something that's really dramatically moving the needle at all on long-term growth. And that's where I think the biggest problem lies. The budget is correct when it says that we've had weak business investment and weak productivity growth and foregone opportunities to have higher incomes as a result. That's absolutely correct. And weak business investment is the biggest source of our slow productivity growth in recent years. And the scale of the challenge is just not something that this budget does much to address. And let me paint a picture there. 10 years ago, we were about 80% or so of the US level in terms of real GDP per person. And now we're about 70% of the US level. The biggest gap that we've seen since the Second World War. So this is a really unusual moment in terms of the weakness of Canada relative to the United States. We would need to have a half a percentage point higher growth than the US in terms of productivity every year for the next 25 years in order just to get back to where we were in 2015. So the scale of the problem and how much we need to move the needle for a quarter of a century, that's what's required to address the productivity challenge that we've built up. And this budget, it has good measures in it, immediate expensing, but it's not doing much long term. And even immediate expensing is temporary and will be phased out. And so it's really not doing much at all for long-term investment incentives.
It's interesting too. I mean, this budget doesn't, or maybe can't really speak to, for example, major projects. Is Canada going to see a new pipeline built, or is Canada going to secure new trade deals, or expand trade with existing partners like in Asia, or have a trade deal with India or China? Because all of these things seem very relevant to Canada's at least short-term growth trajectory.
Yeah. Now, the budget does point to some goals in that regard. So if we think about trade diversification, for example, the goal is of the government to double non-US exports over the next 10 years. Now, I'm of the view that that's actually a pretty easy goal. It might sound really significant and something that would require a great deal of effort. And in some part it does, infrastructure, building out port capacity and rail capacity to physically move the goods that we want to export elsewhere is something we need to do. And so the expansion that's currently going on at the Port of Vancouver and that will be going on at the Port of Montreal, very welcome and will facilitate that. But if all we do is continue the trend of the past 10 years in terms of non-US export growth, 10 years, I should say, again, is a time where we've done anything but see an economy firing on all cylinders. If all we do is continue the trend of the past 10 years, then we reach that goal. Not because of rising goods exports, that gets us some of the way, but it's really because of big growth in services exports, which counts. And tourism in particular. So in the past 10 years, we've seen the growth of tourism increase by a factor about 3.6 times where it was 10 years earlier. So having visitors to Canada, to our parks in Banff or Jasper or wherever, coming in increasing numbers, that's a big source of the non-US export growth that we're likely to see. But so long as the last 10 years, as long as that trend continues, then we're on track to double goods and services exports to countries outside the United States within the next 10 years. So again, it sounds good, but it's not. The economy is going to need a lot more than that to overcome the challenges that have mounted.
Very interesting. We'll see, of course, if this budget passes, but that's maybe more a question for the political scientist, not so much the economist here. Trevor Tombe, always do appreciate the insight. Thank you so much for joining us here.
My pleasure anytime. Take care.
Once again, that was Trevor Tombe, professor of economics at the University of Calgary. He is also director of fiscal and economic policy at the School of Public Policy at the U of C. So again, there is that political question whether this budget will pass. I think there's some pretty clear paths for the Liberals to get it passed, but there is still that degree of uncertainty. We do know that the Conservatives are not going to support this budget. And we do also know this week that one Conservative MP has defected to the Liberals, which gets the Liberals that much closer to having 172. And there have been some rumblings potentially about other Conservatives that the Liberals have been talking to or considering defecting, but who knows what's going on there. I want to play for you some of the exchange from Wednesday in the House of Commons, the first question period after the budget was tabled. The Prime Minister in the House to face questions from Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. A lot of focus on the budget, but there's also a question about another issue that we're going to talk about shortly, so it'll be a bit of a segue into that conversation. Here's the exchange from Wednesday in question period.
Never before have Canadians had to spend so much to get so little. This budget, with its record deficit outside of COVID, is a deficit twice as the size of the one Trudeau left behind, and $16 billion bigger than the Prime Minister promised. It has, in this spending, $5,400 of extra costs for every family in more expensive government. While Canadians are already unable to eat, heat, and house themselves, why is this Prime Minister's costly budget making them pay even more?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, this budget has 75% of the measures are for our sovereignty, to protect our borders, to protect our communities, to protect our way of life. And the balance is for affordability, a middle-class tax cut that the member opposite missed because he was not here. Mr. Speaker, this budget invests in Canada at twice the rate as any budget during this millennium. We believe in Canada. Hear, hear, hear. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
It is twice as expensive as any other budget, and it makes generational debt. And speaking of sovereignty, what about food sovereignty, Mr. Speaker? The Prime Minister's budget increases taxes on food production, with the industrial carbon tax on farm equipment, fertilizer, storage bins, and food processing plants. Sylvain Charlebois, Canada's food professor, says that it is arguably the most damaging aspect of the Liberal carbon tax. It is a tax across the supply chain that undermines the competitiveness of our agri-food sector. Why is the Prime Minister threatening our food sovereignty and driving up our food prices?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, in the spring, this government removed the divisive consumer carbon tax, and that has a consequence. That is a consequence for any business, any farm that emits less than 50 kilotons, which is every farm across this country. Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Climate Institute has done the analysis, and the impact of the industrial carbon tax on inflation is zero.
Apparently, the Prime Minister is still under the misconception that Canadians don't use steel. You remember that interview when he told CTV, he asked the CTV interviewer, "You don't use steel, do you, Steve?" Well, of course, farmers use steel in order to produce their food, in order to store their grains. Processors use steel in the apparatuses of their conveyor belts. The tax on fertilizer and equipment drives up the cost of food, not according to Conservatives, but according to Sylvain Charlebois. So is the Prime Minister going to tell Canadians that an industrial carbon tax on Canadian farmers is not driving up the price of...
The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the impact of the industrial carbon tax on food prices in Canada is approximately zero.
thinks we use zero steel, Mr. Speaker. But on another subject, unfortunately a much darker subject. Last week, the Supreme Court ruled that a 1-year prison sentence was too much for possession of child abuse and exploitation materials. That sentence was already far too low for the two dirtbags who had literally hundreds of impressions and videos of children being tortured. Will the Prime Minister do the right thing, invoke the notwithstanding clause in order to put the rights of children ahead of the rights of those who abuse them?
You're right on to the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure I join all members of this House in condemning the exploitation of children as the most reprehensible source of crime. Mr. Speaker, that is why this government will be bringing forth legislation to combat these crimes, to penalize those who are responsible. That works within our Constitution.
Hear, hear, hear.
So let's pick it up from there. That last question from the Conservative leader to the Prime Minister about this Supreme Court decision last week and what the federal government is going to do in response. What the government has made clear is what they're not going to do, which is what Pierre Poilievre is calling on them to do, namely to invoke Section 33 of the Charter, otherwise known as the notwithstanding clause. Now, this comes at an interesting moment, as we've talked about on this podcast. This debate around the notwithstanding clause, there is actually a case coming before the Supreme Court that could potentially result in some stricter limits around how governments use the notwithstanding clause. But the federal government has this as an option in response to this case, and that would involve tabling legislation and doing all of that. But basically saying we're using the notwithstanding clause to restore this mandatory minimum sentence or possession of child pornography. But the government, as I mentioned, says they're not going to do that. So does that just mean they're throwing up their hands and they're just going to allow this decision to stand? Or are there other ways that the government could potentially address this? And I guess the good news is, if you're hoping for some kind of response from the government to this court ruling, is that there is another option here. Now, look, the Supreme Court hasn't thrown out jail time altogether. There's still a maximum sentence for this crime. So I think that's important to keep in mind. But there is a path here for the government potentially to restore at least something close to a mandatory minimum sentence. So maybe that doesn't satisfy those who want to see the notwithstanding clause invoked. But I think it is an improvement over the current status quo, which is that this mandatory minimum sentence is gone. So this other path, this alternative path, was laid out really eloquently in a piece this week in the National Post. You can read it at nationalpost.com. From our next guest, Steven Penney is a professor of law at the University of Alberta, and he joins us now to talk more about this case and, again, a possible response from the federal government. Professor Penney, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Rob.
Let's establish, first of all, what this decision does and doesn't do. I think, some are maybe reading it as we've sort of thrown out prison as an option for this kind of crime, which is clearly not the case. But what does this verdict actually mean in practice, first of all?
Well, what it means in practice is that unless Parliament responds in some way by amending the legislation, there's no longer going to be a minimum sentence for possessing or accessing child pornography. So what that means is that judges will have the discretion to impose whatever sentence they see fit based on the circumstances of the offense and of the offender. And of course, they're limited by, ordinary sentencing principles and comparing their case with similar cases that have been decided, especially in recent years. And it's also important to remember that the court indicated in this decision in Senneville that sentences for child pornography offenses ought to reflect the very serious nature of this offending, and that all else equal, there's probably going to be an expectation that sentences for possessing child pornography actually increase. So even though the mandatory minimum is gone, at least for the time being, the overall message from the court is that this is a very serious offense and perhaps that sentences should be enhanced rather than diminished.
That's interesting. So it was a 1-year mandatory minimum sentence. And I guess, as the court tries to determine whether that's disproportionate, if it was a 6-month mandatory minimum, might this decision have been different? What was it about a 1-year sentence that they had some issue with?
Well, I think the big problem with many of these mandatory minimum sentence cases is we're trying to decide whether they constitute cruel and unusual punishment under Section 12 of the Charter. And the tool that the Supreme Court of Canada has used for many decades now to make that call is to determine whether or not the minimum sentence is grossly disproportionate to the sentence that the offender would otherwise have received in the absence of the mandatory minimum. So it's not just a disproportionate sentence or an unfit sentence or one that is more lenient or more severe than it should be. It's something that would outrage standards of decency and shock the conscience of the community. So it's a very rigorous standard, at least in theory. And the court is not supposed to be striking down these minimum sentences unless it would either be grossly disproportionate with respect to the actual offender before the court, or, and this is where things get very controversial, and this is where a lot of the pushback has been, or where imposing that sentence, the 1 year in this particular case, would be grossly disproportionate in the circumstances of a hypothetical offender that can be conjured up by the litigants. It has to be realistic. It has to be reasonable. It's something that has to be reasonably foreseeable. But that's exactly what happened in this case, right? So the two individuals in Centerville who were charged and convicted of child pornography offenses, that they had many hundreds of horrific images and videos. Now, we don't even want to describe what was in those images and videos, but Canadians would be appalled at these images. And so there's no question that 1 year was not grossly disproportionate in relation to these two offenders. Instead, what the Supreme Court invoked was the prospect that you could have an 18-year-old whose buddy sends him an image of the buddy's girlfriend, consensually taken, say, nude image or partially nude image of a 17-year-old who was in a relationship with an 18-year-old, and the boyfriend sends that message to his friend. It's a single image of a 17-year-old young woman, and that constitutes child pornography. And it should constitute child pornography. And for that friend to receive that image and to keep it on his phone, that is an offense of possessing child pornography. And perhaps it should be an offense of possessing child pornography. But he doesn't share it. He doesn't use it to extort or intimidate or threaten. He simply has it on his phone, knowing that it's an intimate image of this 17-year-old. So that was the hypothetical scenario invoked by the majority judges in Centerville. And the question is, do we as Canadians think that it is proportionate to have someone like that serve 1 year in prison? And clearly the Supreme Court of Canada felt that that would be grossly disproportionate. And the debate between the majority and dissenting judges in Centerville revolved around whether that was an appropriate comparison. That was an appropriate example, a so-called reasonable hypothetical.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's an interesting question. I think the scenario as you describe it, and most people probably would say, no, maybe a year in prison doesn't make sense. So perhaps then that makes the point that the majority had. Otherwise, I guess is the question, and some critics have pointed this, in that scenario, would that young man even be charged with this crime in the first place? Is it reasonable to look at it that way?
Yeah, so that's the question, right? And that's a really difficult question of constitutional law and legal theory, right? On the one hand, it is perhaps true that it is unlikely for such an individual to be charged. I'm not personally convinced that that's impossible. I think you could have an overzealous police officer, an overzealous prosecutor, think that that's a very grave offense and to prosecute. I don't think that's by any means inconceivable, even though it might be rare. But the larger point is that perhaps it would be better if we simply waited for such an individual to appear before the court and then have that case materialize. And then the court could decide, well, yes or no, would it be grossly disproportionate? And then and only then would the law be struck down. And in the meantime, the main sort of idea behind criminal, child pornography offenses and the 1-year sentence attached to child pornography offenses could be applied. So people like Mr. Seneville and the other accused in that case would receive an appropriately, severe punishment. So that's the argument against this reasonable hypothetical methodology. And there is some merit to that argument. On the other side of the coin, right, we live in a system governed by the rule of law and a principle that, Parliament and provincial legislatures are simply not entitled to pass legislation that could foreseeably infringe anyone's rights. And it's a bedrock principle of constitutional law going back many, many decades that where a law is determined to be unconstitutional in its effects generally, then it is of no force or effect, which is our fancy way of saying it's invalid. It violates the charter. And we shouldn't have to wait for the perfect case to come about with someone who is able to challenge the legislation, who has the resources to hire the right lawyers and the right facts in order to challenge a law. When it becomes readily apparent in any case that a law is unconstitutional, then the rule of law and basic principles of constitutionalism suggest that it ought to be struck down at the earliest possible opportunity. So those are the parameters of the debate. I don't have a particularly strong view about which side is right. I think I have a bit of a preference, but that's not really the main point of my article in the National Post. And it's not my area of expertise. What I'm suggesting, as many others have over the years, is that Parliament can solve this problem quite simply by eliminating the possibility of using reasonable hypotheticals. And I can describe that for you.
Expand on that, because I think what you're outlining, and even the court touched on this, is the idea where there is more or less what we would consider to be a minimum sentence, but there's still some opportunity for some discretion at the same time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's not a particularly novel or complicated idea, right? It's not going to be a mandatory minimum sentence in the sense that we're used to. But effectively, it's going to be a robust and rigorous minimum sentence in all but the most exceptional circumstances. So the way it would work is as follows. So you say, okay, we think that it's appropriate to have a 1-year minimum sentence for accessing or possessing child pornography, that is going to be an appropriate sentence, an appropriate minimum sentence. Obviously, we can go much higher depending on the case specifics. That's going to be an appropriate minimum sentence in the vast majority of cases. And we want to send a message to sentencing judges that should be effectively the floor. And you go up from there because of the inherent seriousness of this offense and the harm that it causes to those who are implicated. Okay, so that's great. But what about the teenager situation? What about the sext? What about the sharing of the file, the reasonable hypothetical? Well, all you have to do is provide for an exceptional circumstances clause within the sentencing provision, a so-called safety valve, that says that if in a unique case or in a special case, the offender can prove, right? So the onus is on the offender, that imposing the minimum sentence would not just be disproportionate, right? Would not just be unfit, would not just be too severe given the culpability of that offender, but it would in fact be grossly disproportionate, right? So it would shock the conscience of the community. Canadians, the average Canadian would be outraged that we would put somebody in jail for that period of time. Then and only then would the judge be permitted to go below the minimum. That would be a very simple fix. Parliament could enact legislation, if not tomorrow, then, just through the usual framework of lawmaking, within a very short period of time. And now the reasonable hypothetical debate disappears. It's no longer relevant because by definition, it would not be possible to sentence someone to a grossly disproportionate sentence. Consequently, it would be impossible to violate Section 12, or at least on that basis. And so you're almost completely eliminating the risk that the law is going to be struck down. And the Supreme Court of Canada has said, both in this case and in several previous cases, that this is an option that Parliament has, strongly hinting that it would be deemed constitutional. So, it's not going to satisfy everyone because it's not going to apply to 100% of cases. And there may be judges, perhaps, who take advantage of this clause and perhaps, conclude that the sentence would be grossly disproportionate, and that decision might not be particularly compelling or accepted by, many others, including many ordinary Canadians. So there is a slight risk there, but there is a way of mitigating that risk by requiring the judge to provide extensive reasons after considering a list of mandatory factors to take into account, and to have to justify that decision to deviate and to explain why it would be grossly disproportionate. And then if the Crown is unsatisfied with that decision, as it might be, then it can appeal that decision and have it potentially overturned. So I think that would, take a lot of the heat out of this debate. It would avoid us having to contemplate using the notwithstanding clause for the first time federally. And, I think it basically solves the problem. It provides Parliament with a mechanism to enforce its wishes and the wishes of Canadians to have, very, strong and onerous sentences for these crimes without completely discarding the principle of discretion in sentencing and the recognition that, it's difficult to define an offense in a way that captures every conceivable possibility. Like, human beings are weird. They do weird things, unexpected and unforeseeable things. And when we think, okay, this is what child pornography is, I have an image of, the kind of person who possesses or uses child pornography. That's not the kind of person who should be walking around without severe consequences. And I'm concerned about the safety and security of my kids, of young Canadians, et cetera, et cetera. All very, very legitimate concerns, right? Driving the desire to have stiff sentences. But you're not thinking about the possible application to these rare but still reasonably foreseeable circumstances where you say, well, I wouldn't want that guy to go to jail for a year. That doesn't make any sense. So that's a safety valve.
It is. And it's interesting too. Obviously, this would involve some work by Parliament to make this happen. But I think maybe people don't appreciate, so too with using the notwithstanding clause. It's not like, the prime minister stands up and holds up a card or flashes a badge and that's that. Like, even invoking the notwithstanding clause, there's a lot that goes along with that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the notwithstanding clause is, very controversial. Obviously, it's been used most frequently by the province of Quebec, the legislature of Quebec, the National Assembly there. And in fact, it's been used many, many times in that province. And of course, we're starting to see it used in other provinces as well, in Saskatchewan, and of course, most recently here in Alberta with respect to the teachers' strike. Now, there are legitimate arguments in favor of having the notwithstanding clause historically. I think it's almost universally accepted that this was absolutely essential in order to get the charter enacted into our Constitution, that many of the premiers, including Premier Lougheed, Premier Blakeney in Saskatchewan, by the way, an NDP premier, insisted on having the notwithstanding clause as a condition for the repatriation of the Constitution and the inclusion of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So, it's a legitimate tool in the sense that it's part of our Constitution, but it's problematic in the sense that it does permit the government or the legislature to override potentially core fundamental freedoms, right? And you always have to think in these cases, not about the issue that's in front of you or your own sort of political or ideological concerns, because the tide can turn. The other side can always gain power and do things that you wouldn't like. So maybe you think that certain interpretations of the Supreme Court of Canada have gone awry and they're not entirely legitimate and you disagree with them vehemently, but there are going to be other people who feel differently about perhaps other charter rights that you cherish and you think are important, maybe freedom of speech, maybe protection for privacy against, governmental surveillance, whatever it might be. And you always have to think, well, what if people that I don't like are in power and they want to invoke the notwithstanding clause to restrict fundamental freedoms that I think are absolutely critical? So that's always in the background, always something that should warn us and caution us to be very, very wary about using the notwithstanding clause. But as you say, there are also some practical limitations on the use of the notwithstanding clause. First of all, right, it's something that would have to get through the Senate. So in our current political kind of alignment, if we imagine that, say, a future Conservative federal government with a controlling majority in the House invokes the notwithstanding clause. Well, there are certain senators. The Senate is dominated by those who are at least appointed by Liberal governments, if they don't currently affiliate themselves as Liberals per se, who've indicated that they are not willing to pass legislation that where Section 33, the notwithstanding clause, has been invoked. Now, that could create a constitutional impasse or perhaps even a constitutional crisis. Right? We don't normally think that the Senate should have the power to block legislation, maybe to delay it, maybe to force some reconsideration or amendments, but not to block it altogether. But they have the constitutional power to do that. That's our system, whether we like it or not. And so would it be possible to invoke the notwithstanding clause federally, given the composition of the Senate? That's one issue. Another issue, which is more structural and fundamental, is the fact that the notwithstanding clause has a sunset provision. So it only lasts for 5 years, after which it lapses unless it is reinvoked. So, every once in a while, governments change and the composition of the House changes. And there's no guarantee that by invoking the notwithstanding clause for something that has, a long-term effect like sentencing law is going to remain effective for anything beyond those 5 years. So that's not to say that it could never be justified to use the notwithstanding clause, either provincially or federally. But it does come with certain costs and certain obstacles. And where there are alternatives to achieve the government's purpose and to reflect people's, preferences and desires about how the law should work that do not involve using the notwithstanding clause, then my preference would be, both from a legal perspective and from a general political perspective, that we should probably prefer those methods rather than invoking Section 33.
We'll see how the federal government chooses to respond to this ruling. We mentioned your piece. It's up at nationalpost.com if folks want to read that. Steven Penney, really appreciate your insight on all of this. And thanks again for making some time for us here.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me, Rob.
Okay. And once again, that was Steven Penney. He's a professor of law at the University of Alberta. And yeah, we'll see what the federal government intends to do in response to this ruling. We played for you that debate from question period. The Prime Minister hinting that something is coming. So we'll see what that is. Also, our thanks to Trevor Tombe, professor of economics at the University of Calgary, some analysis of the federal budget. And again, another big political question as to whether this budget is going to pass. And of course, if it doesn't, that would put us into a federal election. Maybe we'll have a clear idea in the coming days as to what's going to happen on that front. That's where we will leave it for this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Don't forget, you can find us at our website, robbreakenridge.ca. We got a piece up on the budget, some other stuff there as well. I'll also watch for a new episode of the Line Alberta podcast. We'll have that out next Wednesday. More at alberta.readtheline.ca. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend, folks. My name is Rob Breakenridge. We will talk to you next week. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with the Rob Breakenridge Show.